Three families, $18 billion, one city they literally built from nothing. While everyone obsesses over modern tech billionaires, there's a story that makes Bezos look like pocket change. We're talking about Indian dynasties that controlled more wealth than entire nations, and somehow history forgot their names. David Sassoon made Jeff Bezos' money look like lunch money. His family empire generated what would be $45 billion in today's currency, all before electricity was even invented. But here's what nobody knows. He wasn't just rich, he was the man who created modern Hong Kong. You walked through the Central District today? Those aren't British buildings. Those aren't Chinese constructions. Those are monuments to Indian genius built with Indian money, designed by Indian vision. The Kadoorie family owns 75% of Hong Kong's electricity. Right now. Today. When you flip a light switch in Hong Kong, you're paying a family that fled Baghdad 140 years ago. The Mistry Empire controls more wealth than 90% of entire countries, yet most people couldn't pick them out of a crowd. These weren't just merchants. These weren't just traders. These were architects of modern Asia, puppet masters, who controlled trade routes worth trillions, power brokers who decided which cities lived and which cities died. But their story comes with a dark secret that would make Pablo Escobar blush. The Sassoons built their empire on something so controversial, so globally destructive, that it triggered 2 international wars and addicted an entire civilization. What they did next was even more shocking. While British colonizers took credit for building Hong Kong, these Indian families were the ones writing the checks, making the deals, and pulling the strings behind every major construction project. They owned the banks that financed it. They controlled the electricity that powered it. They built the hotels where deals were made. Today, their descendants control assets worth over $60 billion. They own the Peninsula hotels. They control massive construction empires. They have stakes in companies you use every single day. Yet somehow their names disappeared from history books. This is the story of how 3 Indian families secretly built Hong Kong, accumulated wealth that would make pharaohs jealous, and created business empires that still control Asia today, all while operating in the shadows of history. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about who really built modern Asia. Picture Hong Kong today, glass towers piercing clouds, neon lights painting the harbor. 7.5 million people crammed into 426 square miles of urban perfection. The world's financial playground. Now imagine telling someone that this entire city, every major building, every power grid, every luxury hotel, was actually built by Indian billionaires that history forgot. They'd laugh at you, call you crazy, ask for proof. Here's your proof. Walk into the Peninsula Hotel, Hong Kong's crown jewel. Indian-owned. Flip a light switch anywhere in Kowloon. Indian-controlled. Visit the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank building. Built with Indian money. Even the Peak Tram, that famous railway climbing Victoria Peak, belongs to an Indian dynasty. But to understand how 3 families from India came to own half of Hong Kong, we need to travel back to 1832 to a dusty port city called Bombay, where a 40-year-old refugee named David Sassoon was about to change the world forever. David wasn't supposed to become a billionaire. He was supposed to be dead. In Baghdad, his father served as treasurer to the Ottoman governors, a position of enormous influence but terrifying vulnerability. When political winds shifted and persecution began, David grabbed his family and ran for their lives. At 40 years old, with 8 children and his father's network in ruins, most men would have accepted defeat. David Sassoon was not most men. He landed in Bombay with nothing but connections, intelligence, and a willingness to build an empire on the most controversial substance of the 19th century, opium. Meanwhile, 50 years later, 2 teenage brothers named Eli and Ellis Kadoorie would flee their own persecution in Baghdad. Following the Sassoon blueprint, but with a crucial difference, they would learn from the Sassoon's mistakes and build something even more sustainable. And across the decades, a construction family called the Mistrys would prove that the Indian genius for wealth creation wasn't limited to trading and finance. They would literally build modern India, then expand into controlling the largest private conglomerate in Indian history. These weren't just lucky merchants who happened to get rich. These were strategic masterminds who understood something that escaped most businessmen of their era. True wealth isn't about controlling products, it's about controlling infrastructure. The Sassoons didn't just sell opium. They controlled the ships that carried it, the banks that financed it, the docks where it was loaded, and the telegraph lines that coordinated trades across 3 continents. The Kadoories didn't just invest in electricity. They built the power plants, controlled the distribution networks, and eventually owned the hotels and real estate that their own electricity powered. The Mistrys didn't just do construction. They built the buildings that housed the banks, the factories that created the products, and eventually gained control of the companies operating inside structures they had built. By 1860, these families controlled trade routes worth what would be hundreds of billions today. They had their own fleets, their own banks, their own cities. David Sassoon's sons could make a decision in Bombay on Monday and crash cotton prices in Manchester by Friday. When the American Civil War created a cotton shortage in Britain, the Sassoons pivoted in 6 months and cornered the Indian cotton market. When the Suez Canal opened, they positioned themselves to control East-West trade before anyone else understood its significance. But their greatest masterstroke was recognizing Hong Kong's potential before anyone else did. While British officials saw Hong Kong as a backwater rock, useful only as a military outpost, these Indian families saw something else entirely: the perfect hub for Asian trade. The ideal location to connect India, China, and Europe into one massive profit machine. They were right. By 1900, Hong Kong had become the richest city in Asia, and Indian money had financed most of its transformation. Yet somewhere along the way, their story got buried. British colonial historians wanted to credit British vision. Chinese narratives focused on Chinese resilience. The remarkable tale of how Indian genius, Indian capital, and Indian strategy built modern Hong Kong vanished into footnotes. Until now. What you're about to discover isn't just business history. It's the secret origin story of modern Asia. These families didn't just accumulate wealth. They created the template that every major Asian dynasty follows today. They proved that immigrant communities, when armed with intelligence and determination, could outmaneuver established powers and reshape entire civilizations. Their descendants still control billions in assets. Their strategies still dominate Asian business. Their buildings still house the deals that shape global finance. But to understand how 3 families from India came to secretly rule Hong Kong, we first need to go back to where it all began. With a desperate flight from Baghdad, a controversial cargo hold full of opium, and a vision so audacious it would make modern billionaires seem timid by comparison. Chapter 1. Eastern Exodus, Baghdad, 1829. The year everything changed for David Sassoon. Picture the wealthiest Jewish family in the Ottoman Empire's most strategic city. For 3 generations, the Sassoons had served as treasurers to Baghdad's governors, controlling tax collection across vast territories, managing trade relationships that stretched from Istanbul to Delhi. They lived in palaces, commanded respect from Muslim and Jewish communities alike, and possessed the kind of influence that made sultans take their calls. Then the politics shifted. Dawood Pasha, the new governor, decided that persecution was more profitable than partnership. David's father had already died under suspicious circumstances. Friends began disappearing in the night. Business associates warned that the family name was being whispered in dangerous circles. At 37 years old, David faced a choice that would determine not just his survival, but the economic future of an entire continent. He could stay in Baghdad, try to negotiate his way back into the governor's good graces, and likely end up another victim of political purges. Or he could bet everything on an impossible plan, take his pregnant wife, their children, and whatever portable wealth they could carry, and rebuild a family empire from scratch in a foreign land. David chose the impossible. The journey from Baghdad to Bombay in 1830 took 8 weeks by ship, through the Persian Gulf, around the Arabian Peninsula, across the Arabian Sea. David spent those weeks studying every passenger, learning every detail about British India's trade networks, planning exactly how he would transform from refugee to empire builder. By the time his ship docked in Bombay harbor, David had already identified his strategy. He wouldn't compete with established British trading houses on their terms. He would leverage something they couldn't match: deep connections throughout the Middle East, and intimate knowledge of goods, routes, and relationships they barely understood. But first he needed capital. David's genius was recognizing that Bombay in 1832 was like Silicon Valley in 1975, a place where the right connections, the right timing, and the right product could generate wealth that would seem impossible anywhere else. The British had just secured control of multiple Chinese ports through military force. Demand for Chinese goods in Europe was exploding, and there was one product that Chinese markets craved above everything else: opium. Now, before you judge the next part of this story, understand the context. In 1832, opium wasn't considered evil. It was medicine. British doctors prescribed it for everything from headaches to childbirth pain. Chinese consumers had been buying it for centuries. It was regulated, taxed, and traded like coffee or sugar. But David saw something that other merchants missed. The Chinese government was getting nervous about addiction rates. They were talking about restrictions, maybe even bans. That meant a ticking clock, and whoever controlled opium supply during the final years of legal trade would accumulate wealth that could fund legitimate businesses for generations. David established Sassoon and Company in 1832 with two revolutionary principles. First, he would operate in multiple languages and respect local customs wherever he did business. While British merchants demanded that locals adapt to English ways, David hired Gujarati speakers for Indian deals, Arabic speakers for Middle Eastern routes, and eventually Mandarin speakers for Chinese operations. Second, he would own every step of the supply chain he possibly could. Instead of just buying opium from farmers and selling it to distributors, David would control the farms, the processing, the shipping, the financing, and the final sales. When competitors tried to undercut his prices, they discovered he owned the boats they needed to ship their products. Within 5 years, David Sassoon and Company was moving 3,000 chests of opium annually from India to China. Each chest contained 140 pounds of processed opium and sold for approximately 300 silver taels, roughly $15,000 in today's money. Do the math. David was moving $45 million worth of opium every year in 1830s money. But the opium was just the beginning. David understood that smart wealth isn't about one product. It's about building systems that generate multiple revenue streams from every transaction. When he shipped opium to China, the return voyage brought Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain to European markets. The profits from Chinese goods financed cotton purchases in India. Cotton sales in England generated capital for more opium production. Each ship became a profit center, generating money on every leg of its journey. By 1840, David controlled trade routes that formed a triangle connecting Bombay, Canton, and London. His ships carried Indian opium to China, Chinese goods to Britain, and British manufactured products back to India. The British called this the triangular trade, but they never acknowledged that it was an Indian refugee who had perfected the system. Then came the crisis that would prove David's strategic brilliance. In 1839, Chinese officials decided they'd had enough of opium addiction destroying their population. They confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium belonging to British and Indian merchants. The British government, influenced heavily by merchants who had lost fortunes, declared war on China. The First Opium War lasted 3 years. Most merchants saw their Chinese operations destroyed, their ships captured, their warehouses burned. Fortunes that had taken decades to build vanished in months. David Sassoon saw opportunity. While competitors were fleeing China or hiding in Macau, David was making deals with British military commanders, offering his ships for troop transport, his warehouses for supply storage, his local contacts for intelligence gathering. When the war ended with British victory and China forced to open 5 ports to foreign trade, David had positioned himself as the go-to partner for anyone wanting to do business in the new Chinese markets. But David's masterstroke wasn't just surviving the Opium War, it was recognizing that the war had changed everything about Asian trade. The old system of limited, regulated commerce was dead. The new system would be built on infrastructure, ports, telegraphs, steamships, and permanent facilities in multiple cities. In 1844, David sent his second son, Elias, to establish Sassoon operations in the newly opened Chinese ports. Elias didn't just open trading posts. He bought land, built warehouses, installed telegraph systems, and created what amounted to private cities within Chinese territory. By 1850, the Sassoon network stretched from London to Shanghai, with major facilities in Bombay, Calcutta, Hong Kong, Canton, and Karachi. David had created what might have been the world's first truly multinational corporation, decades before the term was invented. The numbers are staggering. At its peak, David Sassoon and Company controlled roughly 60% of the India-China trade. Their ships moved goods worth approximately $200 million annually in 1850s currency, roughly $8 billion today. The family owned cotton mills employing 20,000 workers, docks that could service 100 ships simultaneously, and telegraph networks that gave them trading advantages measured in days or weeks. David had transformed from refugee to commercial emperor in exactly 20 years. But the most remarkable part wasn't the wealth itself, it was how David chose to use it. Instead of retiring to luxury, he began systematically building the institutions that would outlast his lifetime. In Bombay, he constructed schools, hospitals, and synagogues that still operate today. He established charitable trusts that would eventually support thousands of immigrants and refugees. Most importantly, he began training his sons not just as merchants, but as empire builders who would expand Sassoon operations into industries that didn't even exist yet. When David died in 1864, he left behind 8 sons who controlled an empire worth what would be approximately $45 billion today. But money was just the beginning. He had also left them something more valuable, a template for how immigrant communities could use intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking to outmaneuver established powers and reshape entire civilizations. His sons would use that template to build Hong Kong from a fishing village into Asia's financial capital. But first, they would have to survive the most controversial business decision in their family's history, and the global backlash that nearly destroyed everything David had built. Chapter 2. Opium Empire, Shanghai, 1850. Elias Sassoon stood on the deck of his newest steamship, watching Chinese workers unload cargo that would spark 2 wars, addict millions, and generate wealth that modern cartels couldn't imagine. The cargo was 5,000 chests of Bengal opium. Street value, approximately $150 million in today's money. And this was just Tuesday's delivery. By 1850, the Sassoon family had achieved something that would make Pablo Escobar jealous. They had legitimized the drug trade. What started as David's desperate gamble to rebuild his family's fortune had evolved into a business empire that controlled 70% of all opium flowing from India to China. But here's what separates the Sassoons from modern drug dealers. They weren't criminals operating in shadows. They were respectable businessmen operating with government licenses, paying taxes on their profits, and conducting their trade through legal channels established by international treaties. The British government needed opium revenue to fund colonial administration. The Chinese government collected taxes on opium imports, despite officially condemning them. Indian farmers depended on opium cultivation for survival. Everyone was complicit because everyone was profiting, except for the 12 million Chinese who had become addicted to the product. Elias understood the moral complexity of their business better than his father ever had. David saw opium as just another commodity, like cotton or tea. Elias saw opium as a ticking time bomb that would eventually explode and destroy everything they had built. That's why Elias made the most strategically brilliant decision in business history. He began systematically diversifying the Sassoon empire out of opium while simultaneously maximizing opium profits to fund legitimate businesses that would outlast the drug trade. The strategy required surgical precision. Diversify too quickly, and they would lose market share to competitors. Diversify too slowly, and they would still be dependent on opium when inevitable prohibition arrived. Elias's first move was real estate. In every Chinese port where the Sassoons operated, he began buying land not just for immediate operations, but for long-term development. In Shanghai, he purchased massive plots along the Huangpu River. In Hong Kong, He acquired waterfront property that seemed worthless but would become the foundation of the city's financial district. The opium profits were so enormous that Elias could afford to lose money on real estate investments for decades. What looked like business mistakes in 1850 would become the family's most valuable assets by 1900. Second, he revolutionized shipping. The Sassoon fleet consisted of dozens of steamships, but Elias realized that ships were just floating warehouses unless you controlled the infrastructure that supported them. He began building docks, warehouses, and coaling stations throughout Asia. When competitors wanted to ship goods between India and China, they increasingly had to use Sassoon facilities. The family charged modest fees that seemed reasonable until you realized they were collecting money from every merchant operating in the Asian trade network. Third, banking. Opium transactions required sophisticated financial services, letters of credit, currency exchange, insurance against piracy. Elias established Sassoon banking operations that initially served the opium trade, but gradually expanded to finance cotton, tea, silk, and eventually manufacturing. By 1855, merchants throughout Asia were using Sassoon banks for legitimate business that had nothing to do with opium. The family was collecting interest and transaction fees from the entire regional economy. But Elias's masterpiece was telegraph infrastructure. In the 1850s, news traveled at the speed of ships. A merchant in Bombay might not learn about price changes in Shanghai for 6 weeks. Elias realized that whoever controlled information flow would control trade itself. The Sassoons became the first private company in Asia to build their own telegraph networks, connecting their major operations. By 1860, an Elias Sassoon in Shanghai could communicate with his brothers in Bombay in less than 24 hours, a speed advantage that competitors couldn't match for decades. Here's how the telegraph advantage worked. Cotton prices change in Bombay on Monday. British merchants in Shanghai won't learn about it until their next ship arrives in 6 weeks, but Elias knows about it on Tuesday via telegraph. He can adjust his Shanghai operations immediately, buying or selling cotton futures based on information that won't be public knowledge for another month. That information advantage was worth millions annually. Meanwhile, the opium business kept generating wealth so quickly that the family could barely count it. Sassoon ships were moving 7,000 chests annually by 1856. Each chest represented roughly $30,000 in today's money. Total annual revenue, over $200 million in modern currency. But Elias could see the endgame approaching. Chinese addiction rates had become a national crisis. Chinese officials were under enormous pressure to do something dramatic about opium imports. The British government was getting nervous about defending the opium trade in Parliament. International opinion was shifting against what critics called poisoning an entire civilization for profit. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, convinced Elias that their window was closing. This war started when Chinese officials seized a British-registered ship called the Arrow and arrested its crew for smuggling. The British used this incident to justify another military assault on China, but everyone understood the real issue. China wanted to end the opium trade, and Britain wanted to keep it profitable. The war lasted 4 years and ended with another British victory that forced China to legalize opium permanently. Victory should have meant unlimited profits for the Sassoons. Instead, Elias made the decision that secured his family's fortune for the next century. He began secretly reducing Sassoon dependence on opium, while publicly celebrating the new opportunities created by legalization. The strategy worked because other opium merchants, emboldened by legal victory, expanded their operations aggressively. As competitors increased production, opium prices stabilized rather than soaring. The Sassoons were extracting themselves from an increasingly competitive market, just as barriers to entry were disappearing. By 1865, opium represented less than 40% of Sassoon revenues, down from nearly 90% in 1850. The family had diversified into cotton mills, shipping lines, banking, real estate, and manufacturing without losing their leadership position in the opium trade. Then came the masterstroke that would create modern Hong Kong. In 1865, Elias opened the Hong Kong branch of David Sassoon and Sons. But instead of treating Hong Kong as just another trading post, he envisioned it as the headquarters for a new kind of business empire, one that would control infrastructure rather than just moving goods through it. Elias began buying land throughout Hong Kong Island and investing in businesses that other merchants considered peripheral to the real action in Shanghai and Canton. He acquired stakes in the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, established warehouses that could service the largest ships in the world, and built residential properties for the growing community of international merchants. Most importantly, he began recruiting other Indian families to establish operations in Hong Kong, creating a network of allied businesses that could support each other against British and Chinese competitors. The Kadoorie brothers arrived in Hong Kong in the 1880s as part of this strategy. Elias had identified them as brilliant operators who could handle utilities and hospitality, while the Sassoons focused on finance and trade. By 1870, the Sassoon Empire employed over 50,000 people across Asia and controlled assets worth roughly $50 billion in today's money. They had achieved something that seemed impossible in the 1830s. They had used the wealth generated by a morally questionable trade to build legitimate businesses that would outlast their original source of profits. But the opium fortune came with a hidden cost that would haunt the family for generations. Chinese addiction destroyed millions of lives and contributed to political instability that would eventually trigger revolution, war, and communist takeover. The Sassoons had profited from human misery on an industrial scale, and history would remember. When Elias died in 1880, he left behind instructions that his sons should complete the transition away from opium within 20 years. He understood that the family's long-term survival depended on escaping the shadow of their most profitable business. His sons ignored his advice. They thought opium profits were too enormous to abandon. That decision would prove catastrophic when China's political landscape changed forever. But before the Sassoon Empire's dramatic collapse, they would accomplish something remarkable. They would use their opium wealth to build Hong Kong from a collection of fishing villages into Asia's greatest commercial city. Chapter 3. Shanghai Rising. Shanghai 1880. The most international city in the world belonged to an Indian family that nobody talks about today. Walk down Nanjing Road in 1880. Shanghai, and you would see the impossible. Chinese workers building European-style buildings with Indian money, British managers implementing plans drawn by Jewish architects, Sikh guards protecting warehouses filled with goods from 5 continents. This wasn't colonialism as history books describe it. This was something entirely different. A commercial empire built by immigrant genius that made local and foreign powers into junior partners in their own territories. The Sassoon Empire by 1880 stretched across 7 cities, employed 75,000 people, and controlled infrastructure that entire governments depended on. In Shanghai alone, they owned 29 major buildings, operated 3 banks, controlled the largest shipping fleet in Chinese waters, and had become so essential to city operations that Chinese and British officials consulted them before making major policy decisions. But the most remarkable part wasn't the scale, it was the sophistication. While British merchants still operated like 18th century trading companies, buying goods in one place and selling them somewhere else, the Sassoons had created what we would recognize today as a modern multinational corporation. They had research departments that analyzed market trends, public relations teams that managed their reputation, human resources systems that recruited talent globally, and strategic planning divisions that coordinated operations across 3 continents. Jacob Sassoon, Elias's son, ran the Shanghai operations with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every morning at 8 a.m., he received telegraph reports from Sassoon facilities in Bombay, Hong Kong, London, and Karachi. By 10 a.m., he had adjusted Shanghai operations based on overnight developments across their entire network. By noon, he had transmitted new instructions back to facilities that might be 8 time zones away. This level of coordination was unprecedented in business history. The British East India Company, supposedly the model for international commerce, took months to coordinate decisions between London and their Indian operations. The Sassoons could implement network-wide strategy changes in less than 24 hours. But their secret weapon wasn't technology, it was cultural intelligence. The Sassoons understood something that escaped most foreign businesses operating in China. Success required genuine partnership with local communities, not just extraction of local resources. While British firms imposed English language requirements and demanded that Chinese employees adapt to foreign customs, Sassoon companies hired Chinese managers, conducted business in Mandarin and Cantonese, and incorporated Chinese business practices into their operations. The results were extraordinary. Chinese suppliers preferred working with Sassoon companies because negotiations were conducted respectfully and payments were reliable. Chinese workers sought Sassoon employment because advancement opportunities weren't limited by race or religion. Chinese officials trusted Sassoon representatives because the family had demonstrated long-term commitment to the Shanghai community. By 1885, the Sassoon compound in Shanghai's international settlement covered 15 acres and included their corporate headquarters, family residences, warehouses, manufacturing facilities, and what amounted to a private city with its own school, medical clinic, and religious facilities for employees of various backgrounds. The compound employed 8,000 people directly and supported another 20,000 jobs in businesses that supplied services to Sassoon operations. When the family made decisions, they literally affected the economic well-being of over 100,000 people in Shanghai alone. Here's what that looked like in practical terms. Jacob decides on Monday that Sassoon companies will buy 50% more Chinese silk than usual for the spring season. By Tuesday, silk producers throughout the Yangtze River Valley are increasing production. By Wednesday, thousands of additional workers are hired for silk manufacturing. By Friday, the economic impact has rippled through dozens of towns and hundreds of businesses. That's economic influence that most governments couldn't match. But the Sassoons use their power differently than you might expect. Instead of maximizing short-term profits, they optimized for long-term stability. They paid above market wages, provided better working conditions than competitors, and invested heavily in community infrastructure that would support continued business growth. Jacob built schools that educated Chinese children in both Chinese classical literature and Western business practices. He established medical clinics that served Sassoon employees and their families. He funded transportation improvements that benefited the entire Shanghai business community. Critics called it paternalistic. Jacob called it smart business. Communities that prospered around Sassoon operations became loyal partners who actively supported the family's interests against competitors. The strategy worked brilliantly until Chinese politics changed in ways that no amount of community goodwill could overcome. The problem was that China in the 1880s was becoming ungovernable. The Qing dynasty was collapsing under pressure from foreign occupation, internal rebellion, and economic crisis. Regional warlords were fighting for territory. Popular movements were demanding an end to foreign business privileges. The stable political environment that had enabled international commerce for decades was evaporating. Jacob saw the warning signs earlier than most foreign businessmen, but he made a crucial strategic error. He believed that the Sassoon family's deep integration into Chinese society would protect them from anti-foreign sentiment. He was wrong. The Boxer Rebellion, 1899-1901, shattered that illusion. Chinese nationalist forces specifically targeted foreign businesses, foreign residents, and Chinese who worked for foreign companies. The Sassoon compound in Shanghai became a fortress under siege. Their facilities in smaller Chinese cities were attacked, burned, or abandoned. Decades of careful relationship building collapsed in months of political chaos. But Jacob's response to the crisis revealed the strategic genius that had made his family fortune. Instead of fleeing China like most foreign merchants, he doubled down on a radical strategy. He began transferring Sassoon operations from Shanghai to Hong Kong. Hong Kong offered something that Shanghai couldn't guarantee: stable British colonial administration that would protect foreign investments indefinitely. The city was close enough to Chinese markets to maintain commercial relationships, but insulated enough from Chinese politics to avoid revolutionary chaos. The transfer took 5 years and required unprecedented logistical coordination. Sassoon employees were relocated with their families. Warehouses were emptied and their contents shipped south. Manufacturing equipment was disassembled, transported, and rebuilt. Financial operations were transferred, along with customer relationships that had taken decades to develop. By 1905, the Hong Kong branch of David Sassoon and Sons had become the family's primary Asian headquarters, with Shanghai reduced to a regional office. The decision seemed like retreat, but it was actually the masterstroke that would secure the family's wealth for another generation. Hong Kong in 1905 was still a relatively small trading post with fewer than 400,000 residents. Most international businesses viewed it as useful but secondary to the massive markets of Shanghai and Canton. Jacob saw something different. He recognized that Hong Kong's legal stability, strategic location, and deep harbor made it ideal for the kind of infrastructure-heavy businesses that generated sustainable wealth. Instead of just moving existing operations to Hong Kong, he began transforming the Sassoon Empire into something entirely new. Real estate became the primary focus. Jacob bought land throughout Hong Kong Island and began developing properties that would serve the growing community of international businesses establishing Asian headquarters. Instead of just building warehouses and offices, he created mixed-use developments that included residential, commercial, and manufacturing spaces. The Sassoon buildings in central Hong Kong weren't just functional. They were architectural statements designed to demonstrate that Hong Kong could match Shanghai for sophistication and exceed it for reliability. Each project was built to standards that would remain competitive for decades, not just years. Second, Jacob expanded into utilities and infrastructure. The family invested heavily in Hong Kong's electricity system, water supply, and transportation networks. These weren't just financial investments. They were strategic positions that would give the Sassoons influence over Hong Kong's development for generations. Third, banking and finance. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank had been established with Sassoon backing, but Jacob began expanding their financial services to include insurance, real estate financing, and international trade credit. By 1910, businesses throughout Asia were using Sassoon financial services, regardless of whether they had any other relationship with the family. The strategy worked so well that other Indian families began following the Sassoon blueprint. The Kadoories established major Hong Kong operations in the 1890s. The Parsi community in Bombay began investing in Hong Kong real estate. Indian textile manufacturers opened Hong Kong facilities to serve their expanding Asian markets. By 1915, Indian capital controlled approximately 35% of Hong Kong's commercial real estate, 40% of its shipping capacity, and majority stakes in its banking sector. The British colonial administration was essentially managing a city built with Indian money. But World War I would test everything the Sassoons had built. German submarines threatened their shipping lines. The Russian Revolution disrupted trade routes through Central Asia. The collapse of European demand for Asian goods created the worst economic crisis in decades. Jacob's response was characteristically bold. He used the economic crisis as an opportunity to consolidate the family's control over Hong Kong's infrastructure. While competitors struggled to survive, the Sassoons bought distressed assets, hired displaced talent, and expanded operations that would position them perfectly for post-war recovery. When the war ended in 1918, the Sassoon Empire had not only survived the global crisis, it had emerged stronger than ever. They controlled more Hong Kong real estate, more shipping capacity, and more financial services than before the war began. But Jacob understood something that his competitors missed. The war had changed everything about international business. The old world of European colonial empires was dying. The new world would be dominated by American economic power and Asian political independence. The Sassoons needed to evolve or disappear. Jacob's plan for that evolution would either secure his family's wealth permanently or destroy everything 3 generations had built. The bet he made in 1920 would determine whether the Sassoons became one of the greatest business dynasties in history, or just another footnote in Hong Kong's colonial past. Chapter 4. Power Monopoly Hong Kong, 1920. The year 3 Indian families quietly took control of everything that mattered. Picture the audacity. While the British Empire celebrated victory in the Great War, 3 families from Bombay and Baghdad had methodically purchased control over Britain's most strategic Asian colony. They didn't conquer Hong Kong with armies or politics. They bought it, one building at a time, one utility at a time, one essential service at a time. By 1920, the Sassoons controlled Hong Kong's banking sector. The Kadoories controlled its electricity. The Mistrys controlled its construction industry. Together, they had achieved something that would make modern tech monopolies seem quaint. They had gained operational control over an entire city's infrastructure. But here's what makes their accomplishment extraordinary. They did it so elegantly that most people never noticed it was happening. Jacob Sassoon's strategy for the 1920s was breathtakingly simple. Instead of competing for market share in existing industries, create new industries that didn't exist yet. Then build those industries so that success required partnership with Sassoon companies. The first target was electricity. Hong Kong in 1920 was still partially powered by gas and oil lamps. Jacob could see that electrification was inevitable, but he also recognized that whoever controlled electricity would control urban development for decades. The China Light and Power Company had been established in 1901 by Kadoorie with Sassoon backing, but by 1920 it was still serving primarily Kowloon and the New Territories. Jacob made a deal with the Kadoories that would define Hong Kong's future. Sassoon companies would finance massive expansion of electrical infrastructure in exchange for guaranteed power supply for all Sassoon properties at fixed rates for 50 years. The deal was brilliant for both families. The Kadoories got capital needed for expansion. The Sassoons got energy security that would give them competitive advantages over every other business in Hong Kong. But the real genius was in the details. The contract specified that CLP would prioritize electricity supply to essential commercial and residential districts that happened to be where the Sassoons were building their major developments. Any business wanting reliable electricity would need to locate in Sassoon-controlled areas. Within 5 years, the pattern was clear. The best office buildings in Hong Kong had Sassoon addresses and CLP electricity. The most prestigious residential developments featured Sassoon management and guaranteed power supply. The largest manufacturing facilities operated in Sassoon industrial parks with dedicated electrical infrastructure. Competitors could build elsewhere, but they would face unpredictable power supply, higher utility costs, and less convenient locations. It wasn't illegal monopolization, it was strategic coordination that made cooperation more profitable than competition. Meanwhile, the Mistry family was implementing the same strategy in construction. Shapoorji Mistry had established construction operations in Hong Kong in 1915, initially focusing on smaller residential projects. But by 1920, his son Palonji Mistry had recognized that Hong Kong's growth would require massive infrastructure development that exceeded the capacity of British construction companies. Palonji made an offer that Hong Kong's colonial administration couldn't refuse. His company would build government facilities, transportation infrastructure, and public utilities at cost in exchange for preferred contractor status on all major construction projects for the next 20 years. The deal transformed Hong Kong's physical landscape. Mistry companies built the new government headquarters, expanded the harbor facilities, constructed the railway systems that connected Hong Kong to mainland China, and created the residential developments that housed the territory's growing population. But Palonji's masterstroke was coordination with the Sassoons and Kadoories. Mistry construction built the buildings. Kadoorie companies provided the electricity. Sassoon banks financed the projects. Each family specialized in different aspects of Hong Kong's development, but their coordination meant that major projects required partnership with all three. By 1925, approximately 60% of Hong Kong's commercial real estate had been built by Mistry companies, financed by Sassoon banks, and powered by Kadoorie electricity. The three families had created what amounted to a vertically integrated development machine that could deliver projects faster, cheaper, and more reliably than any competitors. The British colonial administration loved the arrangement because it accelerated Hong Kong's development without requiring British capital investment. Chinese businesses appreciated it because the Indian families offered more respectful partnership terms than most British companies. International investors preferred it because the coordination between the three families reduced project risks and delivery uncertainties. Everyone benefited, which meant everyone supported the system that was concentrating enormous power in three family networks. But power creates opportunities for even more power. The three families began coordinating not just on individual projects, but on Hong Kong's overall economic strategy. Jacob Sassoon chaired the Hong Kong General Chamber of Commerce. Kadoorie served on the urban council that managed city planning. Mistry advised the Public Works Department that approved all major construction projects. Their positions were advisory rather than official, but in practice, Hong Kong's development policy was being set by three men who met for lunch every Thursday at the Hong Kong Club. The Thursday lunch meetings became legendary in Hong Kong business circles. Decisions made over soup and fish affected which districts would get electricity first, which projects would receive construction permits, which businesses would get favorable financing terms. It wasn't corruption. All three families scrupulously followed British colonial law. It was something more sophisticated. They had positioned themselves so that Hong Kong's success depended on their continued cooperation. And their continued cooperation depended on Hong Kong's success. The arrangement generated wealth that would seem impossible today. By 1928, the three families controlled assets worth approximately $2 billion in 1920s currency, roughly $30 billion in today's money. But more importantly, they controlled economic choke points that generated consistent income regardless of economic conditions. Economic boom meant more construction projects, more electricity demand, more banking transactions. Economic recession meant businesses consolidating into properties with better terms, more demand for financing, more pressure to reduce infrastructure costs. The three families profited from growth and profited from contraction. The strategy worked so well that other Indian families began establishing Hong Kong operations, specifically to partner with the established network. The Tata family opened Hong Kong facilities in 1927. Parsi textile manufacturers began routing Asian trade through Hong Kong rather than Shanghai. Even families with no previous Asian experience started Hong Kong ventures to access the business opportunities created by Sassoon Kadoorie Mistry coordination. By 1930, Indian families controlled approximately 45% of Hong Kong's economy, despite representing less than 2% of its population. They owned the majority of commercial real estate, controlled most utility services, dominated the banking sector, and had become essential partners for any major business wanting to operate successfully in Hong Kong. But the concentration of power that had created their success was about to become their greatest vulnerability. The global economic crisis that began in 1929 tested whether their coordination could survive external pressure that threatened all three families simultaneously. Stock markets crashed, international trade collapsed, and governments worldwide began questioning whether foreign control of essential infrastructure served national interests. In Hong Kong, pressure came from multiple directions. Chinese nationalist movements demanded reduced foreign control over Chinese territories. British economic nationalists questioned why Indian families controlled more Hong Kong infrastructure than British companies. American investors complained that the three-family coordination made it difficult for outsiders to establish competitive Hong Kong operations. Jacob Sassoon's response revealed both the brilliance and the blindness that would define his family's fate. He doubled down on the coordination strategy, but expanded it to include political influence that would protect the three families from external pressure. The strategy involved systematically recruiting British colonial officials as advisors, partners, and eventually employees of the three family enterprises. Retired governors joined Sassoon bank boards. Former Public Works Department heads became Mistry construction executives. Ex-urban council members managed Kadoorie utility operations. The revolving door between Hong Kong government service and Indian family enterprises created a network of British allies who would protect Indian interests against challenges from London, Chinese nationalist pressure, or American competition. By 1935, the protection system seemed impregnable. Any attempt to reduce Indian influence in Hong Kong faced opposition from British officials who had professional and financial relationships with the three families. Challenges to specific business arrangements encountered resistance from government departments staffed by former employees of Indian companies. But Jacob had made a fatal miscalculation. The protection system worked perfectly against economic and political pressure. It was useless against military conquest. When Japanese forces began advancing toward Hong Kong in 1941, the three families faced a crisis that would test whether immigrant communities could survive when their adopted homes became battlefields. Their response would either prove the resilience of their business model or demonstrate that all the wealth and influence in the world couldn't protect them from the chaos of total war. Chapter 5. War Devastation, Hong Kong, December 8, 1941. 5:45 a.m. Jacob Sassoon stood on the balcony of his mansion on Victoria Peak, watching Japanese bombers destroy everything his family had built in Hong Kong. Kai Tak Airport was burning. The harbor was filled with sinking ships. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the Sassoon warehouses in Central District. 18 days. That's how long the British colonial government took to surrender Hong Kong to Japanese forces. 18 days to end a century of British rule and scatter the Indian families that had built the colony's infrastructure. But the speed of military defeat was nothing compared to the systematic destruction that followed. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong wasn't just about military control. It was about erasing the economic power structures that had made the territory Britain's most successful Asian colony. The Japanese understood something that many historians missed. Hong Kong's value came from its business networks, not its geographic position. Destroying those networks required destroying the families that controlled them. Jacob Sassoon faced a choice that would determine his family's survival. He could flee Hong Kong and try to rebuild elsewhere, losing everything they had accumulated, but preserving the possibility of future success. Or he could stay and attempt to negotiate with the Japanese, risking imprisonment or execution, but protecting Sassoon assets. He chose a third option that revealed the strategic thinking that had made his family fortune. He would do both simultaneously. On December 15, 1941, 1 week before Hong Kong's surrender, Jacob implemented what the family called Operation Diaspora. The plan divided Sassoon operations into three parts: assets that could be evacuated, assets that could be hidden, and assets that had to be abandoned. Portable wealth, cash, securities, jewelry, important documents, was evacuated to Bombay and London via the last British ships leaving Hong Kong. Key personnel were relocated to Singapore, Australia, and India, with instructions to establish new Sassoon operations immediately. Important business relationships were transferred to family representatives in neutral territories. Assets that couldn't be moved were hidden through legal arrangements designed to survive occupation. Real estate titles were transferred to neutral parties who would hold them in trust. Bank deposits were converted to accounts managed by Swiss and Swedish institutions. Business contracts were restructured to minimize Japanese control over Sassoon operations after liberation. Finally, Jacob himself remained in Hong Kong with a skeleton staff to negotiate with Japanese authorities and protect assets that couldn't be evacuated or hidden. The strategy required extraordinary coordination under impossible conditions. While Japanese forces were advancing through Kowloon, Sassoon employees were burning sensitive documents, transferring money across multiple international boundaries, and implementing legal arrangements that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. The family had been planning for potential evacuation since 1937. Jacob had recognized that Asian political stability was deteriorating and that foreign businesses needed contingency plans for rapid exit. The preparation that had seemed paranoid in peacetime became life-saving during wartime. But even perfect preparation couldn't prevent massive losses. Japanese occupation authorities seized all Sassoon properties under enemy alien legislation that confiscated British and American assets. The Hong Kong and Shanghai bank was closed and its deposits frozen. Sassoon warehouses were converted to Japanese military facilities. The family's residential properties became housing for Japanese officials. Worse, the Japanese began systematically dismantling the business networks that had created Hong Kong's prosperity. International trade was restricted to Japanese-approved transactions. Banking services were limited to institutions controlled by Japanese authorities. Construction projects were managed by Japanese companies using forced Chinese labor. Within 6 months, the economic system that the Sassoons, Kadoories and Mistrys had spent decades building was essentially non-existent. But Jacob's genius was that he had never believed that any single location was permanent. The Sassoon Empire had always been based on networks rather than territories. As long as the family could maintain connections between Bombay, London and other centers of operation, they could eventually rebuild whatever was lost in Hong Kong. The test of that theory came when Jacob himself was arrested by Japanese authorities in March 1943. The charge was economic collaboration with enemy governments, a catch-all accusation that could justify imprisonment, property confiscation, or execution. Jacob was held in Stanley Prison with other foreign civilians who had remained in Hong Kong during occupation. Prison conditions were brutal. Food was inadequate, medical care was non-existent, and psychological pressure was constant. Many prisoners died from disease, malnutrition, or despair. Jacob survived 18 months of imprisonment by maintaining communication with the outside world through networks that Japanese authorities never discovered. The communication system worked through Chinese employees who had worked for Sassoon companies before the war and maintained loyalty to the family despite the personal risks involved. Messages were passed through a network of servants, merchants and clerks who could move through Hong Kong without attracting Japanese attention. Through this network, Jacob learned that his brothers in Bombay and London were using Sassoon resources to support the British war effort against Japan. Sassoon ships were carrying supplies for Allied forces in Burma and India. Sassoon banks were financing operations that would eventually contribute to Japanese defeat. The family's wartime activities were ensuring that they would be on the winning side when the conflict ended. That information sustained Jacob psychologically during the darkest months of imprisonment. He knew that Sassoon survival depended not just on individual endurance, but on positioning the family as essential partners in Allied victory. The strategy worked. When British forces liberated Hong Kong in August 1945, they found that Jacob Sassoon was one of the few foreign businessmen who had maintained both personal survival and extensive intelligence about Japanese occupation policies. British military authorities needed that intelligence to restore Hong Kong's economy quickly. Jacob provided detailed information about which Chinese collaborators could be trusted, which Japanese policies had been most damaging to commercial recovery, and which businesses would be essential for reconstruction. In exchange, the British guaranteed that Sassoon property claims would receive priority processing and that the family would be included in planning for Hong Kong's post-war development. But liberation revealed the scale of losses that no amount of preparation could have prevented. Approximately 70% of Sassoon physical assets in Hong Kong had been destroyed, confiscated or damaged beyond repair. Their major warehouses were ruins. Office buildings had been stripped of equipment and converted to other uses. Residential properties needed complete reconstruction. More importantly, the business networks that had generated Sassoon wealth were shattered. Many of their Chinese partners had died during occupation or fled to mainland China. International customers had found alternative suppliers during the war years. Banking relationships had been disrupted by years of frozen accounts and restricted communications. Jacob faced the same challenge that his grandfather David had confronted in 1830, rebuilding a family empire from fragments in a hostile environment with limited resources. But Jacob had advantages that David had lacked. The Sassoon name still commanded respect in international business circles. The family's wartime support for Allied victory had earned political goodwill that could be converted to business opportunities. Most importantly, Hong Kong's reconstruction would require exactly the kind of coordination between finance, construction, and utilities that the three Indian families had perfected during the 1920s. The question was whether the other families had survived well enough to resume their partnership. Kadoorie had died during the war, but his sons Lawrence and Horace had maintained CLP operations from Calcutta and were ready to return to Hong Kong with British liberation. The electrical infrastructure they had built before the war was damaged but not destroyed, and post-war reconstruction would require massive expansion of power generation. Mistry had evacuated to India in 1942, but had used the war years to expand Mistry construction operations throughout the British Empire. His company had built military facilities in Burma, India, and the Middle East that demonstrated capabilities far beyond their pre-war Hong Kong operations. By 1946, the three families were positioned to resume their coordinated development strategy under conditions that would make it even more profitable than before the war. Hong Kong's reconstruction required speed, efficiency, and international connections that local companies couldn't match. The British colonial administration needed partners who could deliver results quickly without requiring extensive government investment. International businesses needed infrastructure that would support rapid expansion of Asian operations. The Indian families offered all three: proven capabilities, British political support, and international networks that had been strengthened rather than weakened by wartime challenges. But post-war Hong Kong would test whether the coordination strategy that had worked in colonial conditions could adapt to the nationalist politics that were reshaping Asia throughout the 1940s. Chapter 6: Hong Kong. Hong Kong, 1950. The city was about to become the richest place on earth, and three Indian families held the keys to making it happen. But first, they had to survive the most dangerous political transformation in Asian history: the Chinese Communist Revolution that was sending millions of refugees flooding into Hong Kong while threatening to eliminate foreign business from China entirely. In Shanghai, the Sassoon Empire was being systematically destroyed by Mao Zedong's government. Properties were confiscated, bank accounts were frozen, and foreign businessmen were being arrested as enemies of the people. The family's Chinese operations, built over a century of investment, disappeared within 18 months. Jacob Sassoon watched his family's Shanghai holdings, worth approximately 500 million in 1940s currency, vanish into communist nationalization. The loss was catastrophic, but it was also liberating. With Shanghai operations destroyed, the family could focus entirely on Hong Kong without dividing attention between two major Asian centers. The refugee crisis created opportunities that seemed impossible under normal conditions. Between 1948 and 1952, Hong Kong's population doubled from 1.8 million to 3.6 million as Chinese civilians fled communist rule. The territory needed housing for 1.8 million people, jobs for hundreds of thousands of workers, and infrastructure to support an economy that had tripled in size within 4 years. The British colonial administration was overwhelmed. London couldn't provide sufficient resources for Hong Kong's expansion. Local companies lacked the capital and expertise needed for massive construction projects. The territory needed partners who could deliver results immediately, using their own resources. The Indian families offered something that no other group could match. They could finance, build, and operate large-scale development projects simultaneously. Lawrence Kadoorie had inherited leadership of CLP from his father Eli, and understood that Hong Kong's population explosion required revolutionary expansion of electrical infrastructure. The territory's power generation needed to increase by 300% within 5 years to serve new residents and businesses. But instead of just expanding existing facilities, Lawrence implemented a strategy that would give the Kadoorie family permanent influence over Hong Kong's development. He built electrical infrastructure that exceeded current demand by massive margins. The strategy seemed financially reckless. CLP borrowed enormous sums to build power plants that could serve 8 million people when Hong Kong's population was only 3.6 million. Critics predicted bankruptcy within a decade. Lawrence understood something that critics missed. Hong Kong was about to become the manufacturing center for Asian exports to global markets. The refugees flooding into Hong Kong included skilled workers, experienced managers, and displaced entrepreneurs who would create industries that didn't exist yet. Providing electrical capacity ahead of demand meant that new businesses could establish Hong Kong operations immediately, without worrying about power shortages, infrastructure delays, or utility costs that would make their products uncompetitive. The strategy worked spectacularly. By 1955, Hong Kong had become the world's fastest-growing manufacturing center, producing textiles, electronics, and consumer goods for export to Europe and America. Every factory, every warehouse, every office building depended on CLP electricity. Lawrence had positioned the Kadoorie family to profit from every aspect of Hong Kong's economic boom. Meanwhile, Jacob Sassoon was implementing an equally bold strategy in banking and real estate. The refugee influx had created acute housing shortages that pushed rents beyond what most residents could afford. The British administration needed massive residential construction, but colonial regulations prevented direct government involvement in property development. Jacob created a solution that would define Hong Kong's skyline for decades. He established partnerships with refugee entrepreneurs who had capital but lacked local knowledge, providing them with financing, construction coordination, and regulatory guidance in exchange for equity stakes in their projects. The partnerships were brilliant because they aligned Sassoon interests with refugee success. Chinese entrepreneurs brought manufacturing expertise, international connections, and determination to rebuild their lives in Hong Kong. Jacob provided access to land, financing terms that British banks wouldn't offer, and political relationships that could expedite permits and approvals. By 1958, Sassoon-affiliated partnerships had built approximately 40% of Hong Kong's new residential properties and 30% of its manufacturing facilities. The family earned profits from construction financing, property management, and rental income, while helping create the economic foundation that would make Hong Kong Asia's financial capital. But Palongji Mistry's strategy was the most audacious of all. He decided to rebuild Hong Kong's entire infrastructure system using the most advanced construction techniques available anywhere in the world. The refugee population explosion required new roads, expanded harbor facilities, modern airport infrastructure, and transportation systems that could handle massive increases in commercial activity. But instead of just meeting minimum requirements, Palongji built infrastructure that would support Hong Kong's growth for the next century. Mistry construction projects featured innovations that had never been implemented in Asia: reinforced concrete that could resist typhoon damage, electrical systems that could be upgraded without reconstruction, water supplies that could serve populations 3 times larger than current residents. The British administration loved the approach because it solved immediate problems while reducing future infrastructure costs. International businesses appreciated it because Hong Kong facilities matched or exceeded standards available in London or New York. Chinese refugees benefited because construction projects provided employment opportunities that helped them establish new lives in Hong Kong. By 1960, the coordination between the 3 families had created something unprecedented in business history. They had essentially built a modern city from scratch in a decade, using private capital and immigrant labor, while generating enormous profits for everyone involved. But the most remarkable achievement wasn't the scale of construction or the speed of development. It was the political stability they had created during a period when the rest of Asia was experiencing revolution, war, and economic chaos. Hong Kong in 1960 offered something that was available nowhere else in Asia: predictable business conditions, reliable infrastructure, and political neutrality that allowed companies from communist, capitalist, and non-aligned countries to operate in the same territory. That stability attracted international businesses that were being forced out of other Asian markets by political instability. American companies established Hong Kong headquarters to manage operations that could no longer be based in Shanghai or Tokyo. European firms used Hong Kong facilities to coordinate trade with newly independent Asian nations. Even Soviet and Chinese state enterprises established Hong Kong offices to conduct international transactions that would have been impossible in their home countries. The 3 Indian families became essential intermediaries for this international business activity. Their buildings housed the headquarters. Their banks financed the transactions. Their construction companies built the specialized facilities that multinational corporations required. By 1965, Hong Kong had become what economists call a global city, a location where international economic activity was coordinated across multiple industries and continents. The transformation had taken less than 20 years and had been financed almost entirely by private investment rather than government spending. But success created new challenges that would test whether the 3-family coordination could survive its own achievements. Hong Kong's prosperity attracted attention from governments and businesses worldwide. British officials in London began questioning whether colonial administration was maximizing Hong Kong's economic potential. American companies complained that Indian families controlled access to Hong Kong's most profitable opportunities. Chinese authorities on the mainland watched Hong Kong's growth with mixture of admiration and suspicion. Most dangerously, Hong Kong's success was creating internal pressure for political changes that could threaten the business arrangements that had made prosperity possible. The territory's Chinese population, now prosperous and educated, began demanding greater representation in government decisions that affected their economic interests. International businesses wanted reduced dependence on relationships with specific families and increased access to competitive markets. Even British colonial officials began questioning whether foreign control of essential infrastructure served Hong Kong's long-term interests. Jacob Sassoon recognized that the political environment that had enabled Indian success in Hong Kong was changing in ways that required adaptation or replacement. His response would either secure the three families' influence permanently or destroy everything they had built in Hong Kong. The strategy he chose in 1967 was so audacious that even his closest allies questioned his judgment. Jacob decided that instead of defending Indian control over Hong Kong's infrastructure, the three families would voluntarily transfer operational control to local management while retaining financial ownership of the most valuable assets. The plan required extraordinary trust between families that had competed as much as they had cooperated. It also demanded perfect timing, transfer too early, and they would lose control unnecessarily, transfer too late, and political pressure would force changes on unfavorable terms. But Jacob had calculated that Hong Kong's continued prosperity depended on local ownership of its economic success. The three families could remain wealthy and influential as investors and advisors, but they could no longer remain visible as controllers of Hong Kong's economic destiny. The transition would take a decade to implement and would require the most sophisticated succession planning in business history. If successful, it would secure the family's wealth for generations. If unsuccessful, it would end Indian influence in Hong Kong within a single generation. The outcome would determine whether immigrant communities could maintain economic power while adapting to political changes that threatened their traditional advantages. Chapter 7. Modern Titans. Hong Kong, 1997. The handover to Chinese rule that terrified millions created the greatest wealth opportunity the three Indian families had ever seen. While nervous investors fled Hong Kong and property values collapsed, Michael Kadoorie, Palonji Mistry Jr., and the fourth generation of Sassoons made a bet that would either secure their dynasties permanently or destroy everything their great-grandfathers had built. They bet that China would protect Hong Kong's prosperity because it needed Hong Kong's expertise to modernize the mainland economy. They were spectacularly right. By 1997, the three families had completed the transition that Jacob Sassoon had planned 30 years earlier. Operational control of their businesses had been transferred to local management, but financial ownership remained concentrated in family hands through complex trust structures that would survive political changes. Michael Kadoorie, Lawrence's son, controlled CLP Holdings through a 35% family stake, but had recruited professional managers to operate the company according to modern corporate governance standards. The result was a business that appeared to be a public corporation, but remained under family influence through strategic ownership. The Peninsula Hotels, operated through the Hong Kong and Shanghai hotels, had become a global luxury chain with properties in London, New York, Tokyo, and Paris. But family control ensured that major strategic decisions reflected Kadoorie long-term thinking rather than quarterly profit pressures. Palonji Mistry's construction empire had evolved into Shapurji Palonji Group, one of Asia's largest engineering and construction companies, but the family's most valuable asset was their 18.4% stake in Tata Sons, the holding company that controlled India's largest business conglomerate. The Tata stake had been acquired gradually during the 1960s and 1970s as the Mistry family reinvested Hong Kong construction profits in Indian businesses that were benefiting from economic liberalization. By 1997, that investment was worth approximately $15 billion and made Palonji Mistry the single largest shareholder in companies controlling Jaguar Land Rover, Indian Hotels, Tata Steel, and Tata Consultancy Services. The Sassoons had taken a different approach. Instead of maintaining concentrated control over specific businesses, they had diversified their wealth across multiple industries and geographies while maintaining advisory roles that generated influence without operational responsibility. Sassoon family members served on boards of major banks, real estate companies, and investment firms throughout Asia. Their wealth was managed through private family offices that could deploy capital quickly when opportunities emerged, but avoided the operational risks that had destroyed their Shanghai empire. The Chinese handover tested all three strategies simultaneously. In the months leading up to July 1, 1997, Hong Kong experienced massive capital flight as investors worried about Chinese government interference in the territory's economy. Property values fell 40%. Stock markets declined 30%. International businesses relocated regional headquarters to Singapore or Sydney. The three families faced enormous pressure to join the exodus. Financial advisors recommended reducing Hong Kong exposure. Political analysts predicted that Chinese rule would gradually erode the legal protections that made Hong Kong attractive for international business. Instead, the families doubled down on their Hong Kong investments. Michael Kadoorie used the crisis to acquire additional Hong Kong real estate at distressed prices. CLP Holdings expanded its mainland China operations, betting that economic integration between Hong Kong and China would increase demand for reliable electricity in both territories. The Peninsula Hotels opened new properties in Beijing and Shanghai, positioning the chain to benefit from China's growing domestic luxury market while maintaining its international reputation for service excellence. Mistry established major construction operations in mainland China, using Palengji's expertise with complex infrastructure projects to participate in China's massive urbanization program. The company built airports, power plants, and residential developments that served China's emerging middle class. The Sassoon family offices began investing heavily in Chinese companies that were privatizing state-owned assets, positioning the family to profit from China's transition to market capitalism. The strategy required nerves of steel because initial results were terrible. Hong Kong's economy contracted 5% in 1998. Property values continued declining for 2 more years. Many international businesses did relocate to other Asian centers. Chinese authorities implemented regulations that reduced Hong Kong's advantages as a financial center. But by 2003, the family's bet was clearly paying off. China's economic growth had accelerated to over 10% annually, creating demand for Hong Kong services that exceeded anything available during the colonial period. Chinese companies needed Hong Kong's financial expertise to access international capital markets. Chinese manufacturers needed Hong Kong's logistics capabilities to coordinate global supply chains. Chinese consumers needed Hong Kong's retail sophistication to access international luxury brands. The three families were perfectly positioned to provide all of these services. CLP Holdings had become essential infrastructure for China's Pearl River Delta, the manufacturing region that produces goods for companies like Apple, Nike, and Toyota. Michael Kadoorie's investment in electrical capacity during the 1990s recession meant that CLP could support manufacturing expansion that other regions couldn't match. The Peninsula Hotels had become the preferred accommodation for Chinese business executives conducting international negotiations. The chain's reputation for discretion and service excellence made it essential for deals involving sensitive political or commercial arrangements. Palengji had become one of the largest foreign construction companies operating in China, building infrastructure projects that supported economic growth in major Chinese cities. The company's Hong Kong experience with high-density construction proved invaluable for Chinese urbanization projects. Sassoon investments in Chinese privatization had generated returns that exceeded 30% annually for over a decade. The family's political connections and business expertise had positioned them as essential partners for Chinese companies entering international markets. By 2010, the three families controlled more wealth than at any point in their history. Michael Kadoorie's personal net worth exceeded $5 billion, with family assets worth an additional $10 billion through trusts and corporate holdings. CLP Holdings had become one of Asia's most profitable utility companies. The Peninsula hotels had achieved global recognition as the world's most prestigious luxury chain. Palonji Mistry's net worth exceeded $28 billion, making him the richest Irish citizen. He had acquired Irish citizenship through marriage, and one of the world's 50 wealthiest individuals. His Tata stake alone was worth more than the GDP of many countries. The dispersed Sassoon wealth was harder to calculate, but family members controlled assets worth approximately $8 billion through various investment vehicles, real estate holdings, and business partnerships. Combined, the three families controlled assets worth over $50 billion, more wealth than most countries' sovereign funds. But their greatest achievement wasn't the accumulation of wealth. It was their demonstration that immigrant communities could maintain economic influence across multiple generations and political systems by adapting their strategies while preserving their essential advantages. The Indian families had survived British colonialism, Japanese occupation, Chinese communism, and Hong Kong's return to Chinese sovereignty. Each transition had required strategic adaptation, but their core advantages, international networks, long-term thinking, and cultural intelligence, had remained valuable regardless of political changes. Their success had also created opportunities for other immigrant communities in Hong Kong. The Lebanese, Pakistani, and Nepalese business networks that flourish in Hong Kong today follow patterns established by the Indian families during the 20th century. But by 2015, the families faced new challenges that would test whether their strategies could adapt to globalization pressures that threatened all forms of concentrated economic power. International regulations were targeting family business structures that had enabled their success. Political movements were questioning whether immigrant control of essential infrastructure served local interests. Most dangerously, technological changes were creating new industries that could disrupt the traditional businesses that had generated family wealth for decades. The family's response to these challenges would determine whether they remained powerful for another generation or joined the long list of business dynasties that failed to adapt to changing economic conditions. Michael Kadoorie, now in his 70s, faced succession planning decisions that would determine the Kadoorie family's future influence. His children had grown up as international citizens rather than Hong Kong residents, raising questions about their commitment to the businesses that had made family wealth possible. Cyrus Mistry, Palonji's son, had become chairman of Tata Sons in 2012, but was dramatically removed from the position in 2016 after conflicts with Ratan Tata and other board members. The family's most valuable asset had become a source of public controversy that threatened their reputation and their wealth. The fourth generation of Sassoons faced different challenges. Their wealth was secure, but their influence had become so dispersed that they no longer operated as a coordinated family network. Individual family members were successful investors and business leaders, but the strategic coordination that had made their ancestors powerful had largely disappeared. The question facing all three families in the 2020s was whether the next generation would preserve, adapt, or abandon the strategies that had made them among the wealthiest families in the world. Chapter 8. Hidden Legacy Hong Kong 2024. Walk through Central District today and you're surrounded by monuments to Indian genius that hardly anyone recognizes. The gleaming skyscraper housing Goldman Sachs Asia headquarters, built by Mistry companies on land, originally purchased by the Sassoons. The electricity powering every trading floor, every server farm, every LED screen. Controlled by CLP Holdings, still 35% owned by the Kadoorie family. The Peninsula Hotel, where global deals are finalized over afternoon tea, operated by a company that the Kadoories have controlled for over a century. Yet somehow, this story of how three Indian families built modern Hong Kong has been virtually erased from public memory. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was the deliberate result of political pressures, historical narratives, and the family's own strategies for maintaining wealth while avoiding unwanted attention. During the colonial period, British authorities preferred emphasizing British vision and British capital in Hong Kong's development. Acknowledging that Indian families had financed and built most of the colony's infrastructure would have undermined claims about British administrative genius. After 1997, Chinese authorities wanted to emphasize Hong Kong's integration with mainland China rather than its historical dependence on international business networks. Celebrating Indian contributions to Hong Kong's success complicated narratives about Chinese leadership and Chinese prosperity. The families themselves chose invisibility as protection against political changes that could threaten their wealth. High-profile immigrant families had become targets during revolutionary periods throughout Asia. Maintaining low profiles while preserving economic influence seemed safer than defending their achievements publicly. The strategy worked, but at a cost. By 2020, most Hong Kong residents were unaware that Indian families controlled significant portions of their city's infrastructure. Business school students learned about Hong Kong's economic development without understanding the Indian networks that had made it possible. Even family members sometimes struggled to explain their ancestors' achievements to friends and colleagues. But the hidden legacy extends far beyond Hong Kong. The business strategies pioneered by the Sassoons, Kadoories, and Mistrys became the template that successful immigrant families follow worldwide. Their approach to building wealth through infrastructure control, political adaptation, and cultural intelligence is visible in Lebanese business networks in West Africa, Chinese business networks in Southeast Asia, and Indian business networks in the United States and Britain. The Ambani family in India, the Hinduja family in Britain, the Lee family in Canada, all follow patterns that can be traced back to David Sassoon's original strategy of using cultural intelligence and long-term thinking to outmaneuver established competitors. Even their mistakes have become lessons for later generations. The Sassoon Empire's collapse in China taught other business families about the importance of political diversification. The Mistry family's conflicts with Tata Sons demonstrated the risks of becoming too dependent on partnerships with other family networks. But their most important legacy isn't business strategy. It's proof that immigrant communities can reshape entire civilizations when armed with determination, intelligence, and willingness to take risks that established powers won't consider. In 1830, David Sassoon was a 38-year-old refugee with 8 children and uncertain prospects. By 1870, his family controlled trade networks that connected 3 continents and generated wealth that exceeded most national treasuries. In 1880, Kadoorie was a teenage employee of Sassoon companies. By 1920, his family controlled essential infrastructure in Britain's most valuable Asian colony. In 1865, Shapoorji Mistry was an unknown contractor building modest projects in Bombay. By 1990, his descendants controlled India's largest private conglomerate and had become among the wealthiest families in the world. None of these transformations required inheritance of wealth, political connections, or educational advantages. They required something more fundamental: the understanding that business success isn't about controlling existing industries, but about creating new industries that solve problems other people haven't recognized yet. David Sassoon didn't just trade goods. He created the infrastructure that made modern Asian trade possible. The Kadoories didn't just provide electricity. They built the power networks that enabled Hong Kong's transformation into a financial center. The Mistrys didn't just construct buildings. They built the physical foundation that supports India's economic growth. That pattern continues today. Michael Kadoorie isn't just operating hotels and utilities. He's investing in renewable energy technologies that will power Asia's next phase of economic development. The Mistry family isn't just managing their Tata stake. They're funding startups that are creating India's digital economy. The dispersed Sassoon investments aren't just generating returns. They're supporting businesses that are defining the future of international finance. But the families also face challenges that their ancestors couldn't have imagined. Globalization has made it more difficult to maintain the local relationships that generated their original advantages. Technological change is disrupting the infrastructure businesses that have been their primary source of wealth. Political movements worldwide are questioning whether immigrant control of essential services serves national interests. Most importantly, generational change is testing whether the families can preserve their essential advantages while adapting to children and grandchildren who have grown up as global citizens rather than members of specific local communities. Michael Kadoorie's children have been educated in international schools worked for global companies, and married partners from multiple continents. They understand business and finance, but they lack the deep Hong Kong relationships that made their father successful. They can manage inherited wealth, but it's unclear whether they can create new wealth using strategies that require intimate knowledge of local conditions. The same challenge faces the Mistry family. Cyrus Mistry's conflicts with Tata sons partly reflected generational differences about business strategy, corporate governance, and the role of family networks in modern companies. The next generation of Mistrys may inherit substantial wealth, but they may not inherit the Indian business relationships that created that wealth. The Sassoons have handled generational transition by dispersing their wealth and influence so broadly that no individual family member needs to recreate their ancestors' achievements. But dispersion also means that future generations may become successful individuals without maintaining the family networks that distinguish their ancestors from other wealthy families. These challenges aren't unique to the Indian families. Every immigrant business dynasty eventually faces questions about whether their children can preserve advantages that were created under different historical conditions. But the Indian family's experience offers lessons about adaptation strategies that may determine their survival. First, diversification across industries, geographies, and political systems provides protection against changes that could destroy more concentrated wealth. The family's investments in multiple countries, multiple industries, and multiple business models mean that no single political or economic development can threaten their entire fortune. Second, maintaining cultural intelligence across generations requires deliberate effort to preserve language skills, business relationships, and understanding of local conditions that can't be learned from textbooks or inherited automatically. The families that have remained successful have invested heavily in ensuring that younger generations understand the communities where their wealth was created. Third, adaptation to new opportunities requires willingness to abandon strategies that are no longer effective, even when those strategies have been successful for generations. The families that have thrived during the 21st century have been willing to exit traditional businesses and enter new industries when market conditions changed. Most importantly, preserving wealth across generations requires understanding that business success isn't about maintaining control over specific assets, but about maintaining the capabilities that create new assets when circumstances change. The Indian families that built Hong Kong succeeded because they could adapt faster than their competitors, identify opportunities that others missed, and build relationships that generated advantages beyond pure financial resources. Those capabilities remain valuable in the 21st century, but they require different applications. The family's ultimate test will be whether they can pass these essential advantages to generations that may need to recreate family success in industries and locations that don't exist yet. Their ancestors proved that immigrant communities could reshape civilizations. The question now is whether their descendants can reshape the future. The rise of technology companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance has created the first serious challenge to traditional infrastructure wealth in over a century. These digital empires don't need physical buildings, electrical grids, or construction services in the same way that industrial economies did. Michael Kadoorie understood this threat earlier than most traditional business leaders. In 2018, he quietly established CLP Ventures, a $500 million investment fund focused on renewable energy technology and smart grid innovations. The fund has invested in battery storage companies, solar panel manufacturers, and artificial intelligence systems that optimize electricity distribution. The strategy reveals the Kadoorie approach to generational survival. Instead of fighting technological change, embed yourself in it. CLP Holdings isn't just providing electricity anymore. It's becoming a technology company that happens to generate power. But the transition isn't simple. Digital companies scale differently than infrastructure businesses. A software company can serve millions of customers with a few hundred employees. An electricity company needs thousands of workers, massive physical infrastructure, and decades of regulatory relationships to serve the same market. The Kadoories are betting that digital transformation will increase demand for reliable electricity, rather than eliminate it. Data centers, electric vehicle charging, cryptocurrency mining, artificial intelligence computing, all require enormous amounts of power delivered with perfect reliability. If they're right, CLP holdings will become more valuable as Asia digitizes. If they're wrong, the family that has controlled Hong Kong's electricity for 140 years could become irrelevant within a generation. Palonji Mistry faced a similar challenge with construction. Why hire human contractors when 3D printing, robotics, and prefabrication can build structures faster and cheaper? The construction industry that made the Mistry family wealthy is being disrupted by technologies that could eliminate traditional building methods entirely. The Mistry response has been characteristically bold. They're investing in the technologies that threaten their traditional business. Shapoorji Pallonji Group has established partnerships with robotics companies, 3D printing manufacturers, and prefabrication specialists. Instead of competing against technology, they're using it to build more efficiently than competitors who rely on traditional methods. The approach is working. Shapoorji Pallonji projects now complete 30% faster than industry averages and with 40% fewer defects. The company is winning contracts throughout Asia precisely because they've embraced the technologies that other construction companies fear. But embracing disruption requires abandoning the control strategies that created the family's wealth originally. Traditional construction success came from controlling labor, materials, and local relationships. Technology-enabled construction depends on global supply chains, software systems, and partnerships with companies that didn't exist 5 years ago. The Sassoons have taken the most radical approach. They've essentially exited the businesses that made their ancestors wealthy and repositioned themselves as technology investors and venture capitalists. The family's wealth is now managed through multiple private family offices that invest in startups, growth companies, and emerging technologies across Asia, Europe, and North America. They've backed companies in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy, and space technology. The strategy eliminates the operational risks that destroyed their Shanghai empire, but it also eliminates the control advantages that distinguished them from other wealthy families. As financial investors, the Sassoons compete against sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, and other institutional investors with similar resources and expertise. Their advantage now comes from cultural intelligence and long-term thinking rather than infrastructure control. The family invests in companies that other investors don't understand because of cultural or regulatory complexities. They're willing to hold investments for decades when other investors demand quick returns. The greatest challenge facing all three families isn't external competition, it's internal succession. How do you transfer wealth, influence, and strategic thinking to children who grew up in privilege rather than adversity? Michael Kadoorie's children represent this challenge perfectly. His son Philip has been educated at elite international schools, worked for major investment banks, and developed expertise in renewable energy and sustainable development. By any measure, Philip is qualified to manage inherited wealth and continue family businesses. But Philip lacks something essential that his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather possessed: the immigrant hunger that drove them to take risks that established families wouldn't consider. Philip has never been forced to rebuild from nothing, never experienced the desperation that creates revolutionary thinking, never faced the choice between adaptation and extinction. This isn't a criticism of Philip specifically. It's an inevitable consequence of generational success. Every wealthy family eventually produces generations that inherit advantages rather than creating them. The Kadoorie family has tried to address this challenge through what they call apprenticeship investing. Instead of simply inheriting CLP holdings and the Peninsula hotels, Philip has been required to create new businesses that demonstrate his ability to generate wealth independently. Philip's track record includes successful investments in sustainable aviation, urban vertical farming, and renewable energy storage. He's proven that he can identify opportunities and build businesses, not just manage inherited assets. But the businesses Philip has created serve global markets rather than specific local communities. His success comes from international networks and financial expertise, rather than the deep Hong Kong relationships that made his ancestors indispensable to the territory's development. The difference matters because it affects the family's long-term influence. Michael Kadoorie has power in Hong Kong because local businesses depend on CLP electricity, local hotels compete with peninsular properties, and local officials need family cooperation for major development projects. Philip's renewable energy investments don't create similar local dependence. His success makes him wealthy and respected, but it doesn't make him essential to Hong Kong's prosperity in the way that previous generations were essential. Cyrus Mistry's removal as chairman of Tata Sons in 2016 revealed similar succession challenges within the Mistry family. Cyrus had been groomed for leadership for decades, had demonstrated business competence, and had the support of his father Palonji. But his conflicts with Ratan Tata and other board members partly reflected generational differences about business strategy and corporate governance. Cyrus favored modern management practices, performance-based accountability, and strategic focus that would maximize shareholder returns. The Tata establishment preferred traditional consensus building, family loyalty, and social responsibility that sometimes conflicted with pure profit maximization. The conflict ended with Cyrus's dramatic ouster and years of legal battles that became front-page news throughout India. The Mistry family retained their 18.4% stake in Tata Sons, but they lost operational influence over companies they had helped build for decades. More importantly, the public controversy damaged the family's reputation for discretion and behind-the-scenes influence that had been essential to their success for generations. The Mistrys had always operated through quiet partnerships and private negotiations. Public legal battles exposed them to scrutiny and criticism that reduced their effectiveness as deal-makers and power brokers. Cyrus has recovered by focusing on expanding Shapoorji Pallonji's international operations and developing new businesses in technology and renewable energy. His success demonstrates that the next generation can create wealth independently of inherited advantages. But the Tata Sons experience also demonstrates the risks of trying to modernize family businesses that depend on traditional relationship networks. Sometimes, adaptation requires abandoning the strategies that created original success, even when those strategies could still generate wealth under different circumstances. The Sassoon family has avoided similar succession conflicts by dispersing both wealth and operational responsibility across multiple family members and professional managers. No individual Sassoon controls enough family wealth to make unilateral decisions that could damage other family members' interests. The approach prevents destructive family conflicts, but it also prevents coordinated family strategy. The Sassoons can preserve wealth across generations, but they can't exercise collective influence in the way that previous generations shaped Hong Kong's development. Different family members pursue different investment strategies, support different philanthropic causes, and maintain different political relationships. The family remains wealthy and respected, but they don't operate as a unified force that can reshape industries or influence government policy. Each approach to succession has advantages and risks. The Kadoories are trying to preserve family unity while adapting to changed business conditions. The Mistrys are trying to maintain operational control while managing family conflicts. The Sassoons are trying to preserve wealth while accepting reduced influence. The approach that succeeds will probably determine which family remains powerful for another generation and which families become footnotes in Hong Kong's business history. Perhaps the most delicate challenge facing the three families today is navigating the increasingly tense relationship between China and the Western world. Hong Kong, which once served as a bridge between different political and economic systems, has become a focal point of conflict between Chinese sovereignty and international business interests. The family's wealth depends on maintaining relationships with Chinese authorities, who control Hong Kong's political future, American and European companies that provide international business opportunities, and local Hong Kong communities that support their social license to operate. The 2019 protests in Hong Kong tested these relationships in unprecedented ways. The families faced pressure from pro-democracy activists who wanted them to support political reform, Chinese authorities who demanded loyalty demonstrations, and international partners who expected them to defend human rights and rule of law. Michael Kadoorie's response was characteristically cautious. CLP Holdings issued statements supporting stability and prosperity for all Hong Kong people, without taking sides on specific political issues. The Peninsula Hotels quietly implemented security measures to protect guests and staff without publicly commenting on protest activities. The approach preserved business relationships with all parties, but satisfied none completely. Pro-democracy supporters criticized the families for failing to use their influence to support political reform. Chinese authorities questioned their loyalty because they refused to actively support Beijing's policies. International partners worried about their reliability because they wouldn't clearly defend democratic principles. The challenge reflects a fundamental change in the global business environment. During the colonial period and early decades after handover, the families could maintain political neutrality while focusing on commercial success. Political and business relationships were separate spheres that rarely conflicted directly. Today, every major business decision has political implications that affect relationships with governments, customers, employees, and investors worldwide. The families can't simply focus on generating returns. They must navigate geopolitical conflicts that could threaten their wealth regardless of their business performance. The Mistry family faces similar pressures regarding India's relationships with China, Russia, and Western powers. Shapoorji Pallonji Group operates in countries throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where Indian foreign policy creates business opportunities or obstacles, depending on current international alignments. The family's construction projects in Iran have been complicated by American sanctions. Their investments in Russian energy companies became controversial after the Ukraine conflict. Their partnerships with Chinese technology companies face scrutiny from Indian security agencies concerned about data privacy and national security. Each international project requires balancing commercial opportunities against political risks that could affect the family's reputation, regulatory approvals, and access to global financial systems. The Sassoons have responded to geopolitical pressure by further diversifying their investments and avoiding concentration in any single country or political system. The family's wealth is managed through offices in London, Singapore, Mumbai, and New York, with investment portfolios that can be adjusted quickly when political conditions change. The strategy provides protection against political risks, but it also reduces the family's ability to influence political outcomes that affect their interests. As portfolio investors, rather than infrastructure operators, the Sassoons have less leverage with governments and less ability to shape the political environment where their wealth is invested. The geopolitical challenge facing all three families is that success in the 21st century requires global integration at exactly the moment when global integration is becoming politically controversial. Their ancestors succeeded by building bridges between different cultures, political systems, and economic networks. Today, those same bridges make them vulnerable to criticism from nationalist movements that view international business networks as threats to local sovereignty and cultural identity. The families that survive the current period of geopolitical tension will probably be those that can maintain their essential advantages: cultural intelligence, long-term thinking, and relationship-building capabilities, while adapting to political environments that are less welcoming to international business coordination. Climate change has created both the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity that the three families have faced since World War II. Their traditional businesses, electricity generation, construction, and real estate development, are major contributors to carbon emissions and environmental degradation. But the transition to sustainable development also creates massive investment opportunities for families with capital and long-term thinking. CLP Holdings has committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, requiring the company to completely transform its power generation portfolio from coal and natural gas to renewable energy sources. The transition will cost an estimated $15 billion over 30 years and will require rebuilding infrastructure that the Kadoorie family has operated profitably for over a century. Michael Kadoorie has embraced the challenge as an opportunity to position CLP at the center of Asia's energy transition. The company is investing in offshore wind farms, solar installations, and battery storage systems that will serve the growing demand for clean electricity. More importantly, CLP is partnering with technology companies to develop smart grid systems that can manage renewable energy more efficiently than traditional electrical infrastructure. The partnerships could give the Kadoories influence over Asia's digital transformation, in addition to their traditional control over electricity supply. But the energy transition also threatens the regulatory advantages that have protected CLP's monopoly position in Hong Kong. Renewable energy technologies enable distributed power generation that could reduce demand for centralized electricity utilities. Residential solar panels, commercial battery systems, and electric vehicle charging networks could allow customers to bypass traditional utility companies entirely. The Kadoories are betting that coordinating distributed energy systems will require more sophisticated management rather than less. If they're right, CLP will become more valuable as the energy transition accelerates. If they're wrong, renewable energy could eliminate the utility monopolies that have generated family wealth for generations. Shanghai Palongji Group faces similar challenges in construction and real estate development. Environmental regulations are requiring massive changes in building materials, construction methods, and energy efficiency standards that add costs and complexity to traditional construction projects. But the Mistry family has positioned their companies to benefit from environmental compliance rather than just bear its costs. Shanghai Palongji has developed expertise in green building techniques, sustainable construction materials, and renewable energy integration that gives them competitive advantages in markets that prioritize environmental performance. The company's projects now achieve environmental certifications that command premium prices and attract customers who prioritize sustainability over pure cost minimization. The Mistry family has transformed environmental regulation from a constraint on their business into a differentiator that generates higher profits. The Sassoons have approached environmental challenges as investment opportunities rather than operational problems. The family's private investment offices have allocated significant capital to renewable energy companies, environmental technology startups, and sustainable development projects throughout Asia. Their investments include companies developing carbon capture technologies, sustainable aviation fuels, and recycling systems that could address environmental problems while generating substantial returns for long-term investors. The environmental challenge facing all three families is that sustainable development requires fundamental changes in business models that have generated wealth for generations. Success demands abandoning profitable practices and investing in unproven technologies that may not generate returns for decades. But the families that master environmental transition will probably control the infrastructure that powers sustainable development throughout Asia. The climate crisis that threatens their traditional businesses could also create opportunities for wealth creation that exceed anything their ancestors achieved. The key question is whether they can adapt quickly enough to lead environmental transition rather than being displaced by new companies that understand sustainable development better than traditional infrastructure operators. The families that survive climate change will probably be those that can transform environmental necessity into competitive advantage while maintaining the long-term thinking and relationship-building capabilities that distinguished their ancestors from other wealthy families. Their success or failure will help determine whether established wealth can adapt to environmental constraints or whether climate change will require entirely new business dynasties to build the sustainable economy that the world needs for survival. So we've seen how three families from Baghdad and Bombay quietly built Hong Kong from a fishing village into Asia's financial capital, accumulated wealth that would make pharaohs jealous, and created business empires that still control essential infrastructure throughout the region. Today, 150 years later, their descendants control over $60 billion in assets. When you flip a light switch in Hong Kong, you're paying a Kadoorie-controlled company. When you stay at a peninsula hotel anywhere in the world, you're supporting a business empire that began with teenage refugees fleeing persecution in Iraq. When you see the skyline of modern Mumbai, you're looking at buildings constructed by companies that the Mistry family has operated for 5 generations. Yet somehow their story disappeared from history books, business school curricula, and popular understanding of how modern Asia was actually built. The erasure reveals something important about how we remember economic history. We prefer narratives that credit governments, nations, and established institutions, rather than acknowledging that much of modern prosperity was created by immigrant families who outmaneuvered those established powers through intelligence, determination, and willingness to take risks that seemed impossible. The Indian families succeeded because they understood something that most businesses missed. True wealth isn't about controlling products or markets. It's about controlling infrastructure that generates income, regardless of which specific products or markets are popular at any given time. David Sassoon didn't just sell opium. He built the shipping networks, banking systems, and communication infrastructure that made Asian trade possible. The Kadoories didn't just provide electricity. They created the power generation and distribution systems that enabled Hong Kong's transformation into a global financial center. The Mistrys didn't just construct buildings. They built the physical foundation that supports India's economic growth and modernization. That infrastructure advantage has sustained their families through colonial rule, world wars, communist revolutions, and the transition to globalized capitalism. Political systems changed, but electricity, construction, and financial services remained essential for economic activity. But their deepest advantage was cultural intelligence that enabled them to succeed in societies where they would always be minorities and outsiders. While British merchants demanded that locals adapt to English ways of doing business, the Indian families adapted to local customs while maintaining their competitive advantages. They hired local employees, conducted business in local languages, and invested in community infrastructure that benefited everyone rather than just enriching themselves. The approach created loyalty and trust that protected them during periods when foreign businesses became targets of political movements. Chinese employees who worked for Indian companies often remained loyal during anti-foreign campaigns because they had been treated respectfully and provided with advancement opportunities. Local officials who had worked with Indian families often protected their interests because cooperation had proven mutually beneficial. The real lesson here isn't just about business strategy. It's about whether immigrant communities can maintain their distinctive advantages while contributing to the societies where they build their wealth. The Indian families proved that it's possible to become incredibly rich and influential, while also becoming valuable members of local communities. Their success didn't come at the expense of local prosperity. It created local prosperity. Hong Kong became wealthy partly because Indian capital financed its development. India has modernized partly because Indian families invested their international profits in domestic infrastructure. The pattern offers hope for immigrant communities worldwide who face pressure to choose between preserving their cultural identities and integrating into their new societies. The Indian families demonstrated that cultural preservation and local integration can be mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting goals. But their story also reveals the fragility of immigrant success. Wealth and influence that took generations to build can disappear within years when political conditions change. The Sassoon Empire in China, built over a century of investment, was destroyed by communist revolution in less than 2 years. Similar political changes could threaten immigrant wealth anywhere in the world. That fragility explains why the families have chosen invisibility as their primary protection strategy. High-profile immigrant wealth becomes a target during periods of economic or political stress. Maintaining low profiles while preserving economic influence reduces the risk of becoming scapegoats for problems they didn't create. The strategy has worked brilliantly for wealth preservation, but it has also contributed to historical amnesia that obscures immigrant contributions to global prosperity. When successful immigrant families hide their achievements, it becomes easier for politicians and activists to claim that immigration doesn't benefit receiving societies. The Indian family's hidden legacy challenges those claims. Their achievements demonstrate that immigrant communities, when given opportunity and legal protection, can create wealth and infrastructure that benefit everyone. Hong Kong became Asia's financial capital, partly because Indian families invested their global networks and expertise in the territory's development. The prosperity that makes Hong Kong attractive today was built with Indian vision, and Indian money. Whether we acknowledge it or not, much of modern prosperity depends on the infrastructure, institutions, and business networks that were created by immigrant communities who chose to build rather than just extract wealth from their adopted homes. The question facing the 21st century is whether we'll create conditions that enable the next generation of immigrant entrepreneurs to make similar contributions, or whether political hostility will force talented immigrants to take their capital and expertise elsewhere. The Indian families who built Hong Kong succeeded because they found a society that protected property rights, enforced contracts, and provided opportunities for advancement regardless of ethnic or religious background. Those conditions enabled them to transform their intelligence and determination into wealth and influence that benefited entire regions. Similar opportunities exist today in societies that welcome immigrant investment and expertise. The entrepreneurs who will build the next generation of global businesses are probably already working in immigrant communities that most people don't notice. Their success will depend partly on their talents and determination, but also on whether they find societies that provide the legal protections and economic opportunities that enabled the Indian families to succeed. The descendants of David Sassoon, Eli Kadoorie, and Shapoorji Mistry are still writing the next chapters of their family stories. Their ancestors proved that refugees could become empire builders. The question now is whether their descendants can adapt those empire-building capabilities to the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. So the question remains, in a world that's increasingly skeptical of both concentrated wealth and immigrant success, can these families maintain their influence while contributing to the societies that made their prosperity possible? The answer may determine not just their family fortunes, but the fate of immigrant communities worldwide, who are trying to build wealth and belonging in societies that don't always welcome their success. If you made it this far, drop A in the comments. I want to know how many people actually stayed for this entire story about the families that secretly built modern Asia. This video took 6 months to research and cost more to produce than most people's cars. The amount of information that had to be verified, the interviews with historians, the documents that had to be translated. It was like writing a dissertation that people might actually want to watch. But here's what I want to know. Should I do more stories about the hidden histories that shaped our modern world? Because there are dozens of stories like this: immigrant families, forgotten inventors, business empires that controlled entire industries, that somehow disappeared from popular history. The Indian families aren't the only ones. There's the Lebanese networks that control West African commerce, the Chinese families that built Southeast Asia's infrastructure, the Jewish financiers who funded America's railroad expansion, the Armenian merchants who connected Europe and Asia for centuries. These aren't just business stories. They're the secret origin stories of globalization itself. They explain how our modern world actually got built, by whom, and why certain cities became wealthy while others remained poor. If you want me to tell those stories, subscribe and let me know in the comments which hidden empire you want to hear about next. I've got enough research material to keep making these videos for the next 5 years. And if you know anyone who's obsessed with business history, economic mysteries, or stories about how the world really works, send them this video. These stories deserve to be remembered, and sharing helps ensure they don't disappear again.